My mother used to say it with a smile. Not a cruel smile, something worse. The soft, absent kind, like she'd already forgotten I was in the room. Your brother, she'd say, is going to do great things. And then she'd look at me, and the smile would stay exactly the same, and she'd say nothing at all. I was 29 years old the weekend my brother got married. I drove 4 hours to be there. I ironed my dress the night before. I bought them a gift from the registry. The good one. The Le Creuset Dutch oven that nobody else had claimed. I did everything right. I always did everything right. It never seemed to matter. My name is Maya. I'm the older one by 3 years. My brother's name is Daniel. For as long as I can remember, those two facts have existed in complete contradiction. Because in my family, being older meant being the trial run, the rough draft. The child my parents had before they figured out what they actually wanted. Daniel is charming in the way that makes people forgive him for things they'd never forgive anyone else. He laughs too loud and takes up too much space. And somehow, that reads as confidence instead of carelessness. He got decent grades and played lacrosse and knew how to talk to adults at parties, and my parents mistook all of that for destiny. By the time he was 20, they were already talking about him like he was inevitable. Like he was a fact of nature. I was quieter, more careful. I spent more time reading than talking, more time working than performing, and my parents read that as smallness. As a lack of ambition. My father once told me when I was in high school that I needed to put myself out there more. What he meant, I understood later, was that I needed to be more like Daniel. Louder. Easier. More comfortable making other people feel good about themselves. I didn't know how to do that. I still don't really. What I knew how to do was work. I graduated with a degree in biochemistry from a school my parents described to their friends as a fine school. Not a great school. A fine one. Daniel went to a school they called excellent at every opportunity. The fact that my school's biochemistry program was ranked higher than his business program was a detail that never came up at dinner. After graduation, I went into pharmaceutical research. I spent 3 years at a mid-sized lab in Boston. Learned everything I could, and then, quietly, without making a big announcement about it, I co-founded a company with 2 colleagues I trusted. We focused on diagnostic tools, affordable ones, designed to work in under-resourced clinical settings. It wasn't glamorous work. It didn't come with a title that impressed people at parties. But it was real, and it mattered, and we were good at it. I didn't tell my family much about it. I'd tried, early on, called my mother one Sunday to explain what we were building and why it was significant, and she listened for about 90 seconds before asking whether I'd heard that Daniel had been promoted. I stopped trying after that. It was easier to keep my work life and my family life in separate rooms and never open the door between them. My parents knew I worked in biotech. They knew I was doing something with a small company. Beyond that, they didn't ask, and I didn't offer. Daniel, meanwhile, had climbed steadily through a mid-tier consulting firm, earned a VP title at 26, and was engaged to a woman named Priya, who had a PhD in public health and, as I would come to understand, had actually heard of my company. The wedding was in Connecticut, at an estate venue about 20 minutes outside of Hartford. My parents had been planning it for over a year. My mother had called me 4 times during that year. Twice to ask if I was bringing a +1. I wasn't. Once to confirm my dietary restrictions, and once, about 2 weeks before the wedding, to let me know that the seating arrangement had been finalized and that I was at table 11. That sounds fine, I said. It's near the garden entrance, she said. Like that was an explanation. I looked up the venue floor plan online afterward, because I am the kind of person who does that. Table 11 was the farthest from the head table. It was near the catering exit. I almost didn't go. I want to be honest about that. I sat in my apartment the Thursday before and genuinely weighed the cost of sending a card and a polite excuse. But Daniel and I had always had a different relationship than the one I had with my parents. He'd been shaped by them, favored by them, and I didn't hold that against him the way maybe I should have. He was my brother. He'd called me himself to ask if I was coming. So I went. I arrived on the Saturday morning, the day before the ceremony, because my mother had organized a family brunch. I wore a blue wrap dress and drove my car, a sensible used Volvo, not the kind of car my parents would have approved of, and parked in the main lot of the venue. My parents were already there when I walked in. My father was talking to Daniel's future in-laws. My mother was directing someone about centerpieces. Neither of them looked up when I entered. Daniel crossed the room and hugged me and said, "I'm really glad you came," and I believed him. The brunch was fine. I sat between an aunt I barely knew and a cousin who was 12 years old and mostly interested in his phone. My parents sat at the center of the table with Daniel and Priya. And Priya's parents, who were warm and funny and clearly delighted about the marriage. I ate Benedict and drank coffee and spoke when spoken to and tried not to notice the way my mother introduced me to Priya's aunt. "This is Maya," she said. "Daniel's older sister." That was the whole sentence. Nothing after it. Priya's aunt smiled politely, and my mother had already turned away. I'm not going to pretend that didn't land somewhere. It always does. You'd think by 29 you'd have built up enough scar tissue that it slides off clean. You haven't. Or at least I hadn't. After brunch, I went back to my hotel room and called my closest friend, Jess, who has known my family situation since college and who is constitutionally incapable of pretending things are fine when they aren't. "Remind me why you're there," she said, "because Daniel asked me to be." Daniel, who has been passively benefiting from your marginalization for 30 years? He's not malicious. He just grew up in the same house I did. Jess made a sound that communicated significant skepticism, but ultimately let it go. "Call me after the reception. I want to hear everything." The ceremony the next afternoon was genuinely beautiful. Priya walked down the aisle in an ivory lehenga and Daniel cried, visibly, unself-consciously, in a way I'd never seen from him before. One daughter as a doctor. About my family dynamics, I couldn't watch my brother cry at his wedding and feel nothing. Something in my chest loosened a little. The reception began at 6. I found my place card at table 11, near the garden exit, next to two of my father's work colleagues and their spouses, people who knew my father professionally and therefore knew Daniel's name and accomplishments, and knew nothing about me except that I was the daughter. The conversation was pleasant enough. We talked about Hartford and about the venue and about someone's recent trip to Portugal. I ate the salmon. I drank one glass of wine. Halfway through dinner, Priya began making the rounds. This is the kind of person she is. The kind who doesn't just stand at the head table receiving congratulations, but actually walks to every table, sits down for 2 minutes, asks a real question. I watched her move through the room with genuine curiosity about the people in it. When she got to table 11, she'd already been talking to my father's colleague on my left for about a minute when she turned to me. "You're Maya," she said. Not a question. "I am," I said. "Congratulations. The ceremony was really lovely." "Thank you." She smiled, but she was looking at me with a slight tilt to her head, the way people do when they're trying to place something. "I'm sorry. Can I ask what you do?" "I work in biotech," I said. "Diagnostics." The tilt got more pronounced. "What company?" I told her. Priya put down her champagne glass. "I'm sorry," she said. Are you the Maya Reeves? The co-founder?" "I am," I said slowly. "Oh my God." She turned to look at the head table, then back at me, then back at the head table again. And I could see her doing the math in real time. She turned back to me and her voice dropped to something careful and precise. Daniel told me his sister worked in biotech. He didn't. I don't think he realized. It's fine, I said. He doesn't know that much about my work. Maya. She leaned forward slightly. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on access to point-of-care diagnostics in low-income clinical settings. Your company's lateral flow panel is literally cited in the methodology section. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said, I'm glad it was useful. Your work is being piloted in 3 countries, she said. We covered it in a seminar I TA'd. My students know your name. The table had gone quiet. My father's colleague on my left had stopped his conversation. I was acutely aware of the silence radiating outward from where we were sitting. Priya stood up. I don't think she fully decided to do what she did next. I think it was instinct, the kind of action that bypasses calculation. She picked up her champagne glass and she walked to the center of the room, and she tapped it with her spoon. I know we're between toasts, she said, when the room settled. But I just found out something that I think everyone here should know. Daniel looked up from the head table with an expression of mild alarm. My new sister-in-law, Priya said, and she gestured toward table 11, toward me, is one of the co-founders of a company that is changing how people in under-resourced communities access medical diagnostics. Her work is being implemented in Ghana, Bangladesh, and rural Guatemala, and she is sitting at table 11 near the exit because nobody told me who she was, and that is something I intend to correct right now. The room was completely silent. My mother had gone very still. My father was looking at his plate. Daniel was looking at me. His expression was not the one I expected. It wasn't embarrassed. It wasn't performatively proud. The kind of pride that's really just relief that the family looks good. It was something quieter and harder to name, like someone who has just understood something they should have understood a long time ago and knows it. He stood up from the head table. He walked across the room to table 11. He sat down in the empty chair next to mine. I didn't know, he said. I knew you had a company. I didn't. Maya, why didn't you tell me? I tried, I said. A few years ago, you were busy. He absorbed that. That's not an excuse. No, I said. It isn't. We sat there for a moment. Around us, the room had begun to murmur back to life, but more slowly than before, with a different quality to it. My father came over about 10 minutes later. He sat across from me, and he looked at his hands for a moment before he looked up. I didn't know the scope of what you were doing, he said. I know, I said. I should have asked. Yes, I said. You should have. He didn't apologize. My father is not a man who finds apologies easy, and I have stopped expecting a version of him that doesn't exist, but he said I should have asked, and he meant it, and I filed that away as the thing it was, small, insufficient, real. My mother came over last. She stood at the edge of the table for a moment before she sat down, and she looked at me with an expression I didn't have a name for. Not exactly shame. Something more fragile. Priya didn't know, she said finally. No. Why would she? Nobody in this family talks about my work. We didn't know. You didn't ask, I said. Not loudly. Not with the years of accumulated heat behind it that I could have put there. Just clearly. There's a difference. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, You're right. I sat with that. My mother admitting I was right was not a common occurrence. I didn't celebrate it. I didn't dismiss it. I just let it exist. Daniel stayed at my table for the rest of dinner. Priya came back, and the two of them and I talked for almost an hour. Really talked. The way you talk when all the performing has been stripped out of it. Priya asked questions about our distribution model and our funding structure and whether we'd considered expanding into Southeast Asia, and I answered them honestly. And it felt like the most normal conversation I'd had with anyone in my family in a decade. When I drove back to my hotel that night, I called Jess. "Tell me everything," she said. So I did. "Maya," she said when I finished, "yeah. That woman cited you in her dissertation." "She did. And your parents didn't know what you did. They knew. They just didn't know what it meant." Jess was quiet for a moment. "Is that better or worse?" "I don't know," I said. "I've been thinking about that. I've been thinking about that. I've been thinking about it since. I don't think my parents are going to transform overnight. I don't think my father is suddenly going to call me and ask about our quarterly milestones. I don't think my mother is going to stop seeing Daniel as the centerpiece and me as the footnote in every story she tells about her children. Those patterns were built over 30 years. They don't dissolve because of one evening. But something shifted. I watched my brother sit down next to me in a room full of people and choose me, visibly and without hesitation. And I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph, exactly. Something quieter. Something that felt more like being known. I don't need my parents to understand my work. I spent years building something real and meaningful without their understanding. And I'll continue to. But I think about the version of myself that stayed in those patterns forever, that kept the door between her two lives permanently shut, kept the work and the family in separate rooms, kept swallowing the smallness of being introduced as Daniel's sister and letting it be the whole sentence. That version of me would have driven home from that wedding and called Jess and said it was fine. It wasn't fine. It hadn't been fine for a long time. And the reason I know that now, the reason I can say it clearly instead of just carrying it, is that someone walked across a room and said my name and told the truth about who I was. Not because I asked her to. Because she thought it was worth saying. I've been told more than once that I should be angrier than I am. That the situation with my family warrants more fire, more ultimatums, more dramatic exits. Maybe that's true for some people. I'm not wired that way. What I do instead is build things. I build things that matter, and I work with people who see me clearly, and I let that be enough. What I've learned, slowly and not without cost, is that the people who will recognize your worth are rarely the ones you spent your childhood hoping would. They're the woman who cited you in her dissertation before she ever met you. They're the colleague who stayed at the lab until midnight 3 nights in a row because she believed in what you were building. They're the friend who says, "Remind me why you're there," and means it as an act of care. Build your table. Fill it with those people. And if someone seats you near the exit at someone else's table, sit there with your back straight and wait. Because sometimes the person who changes the whole room walks right past the head table and finds you first. What happened at that wedding didn't feel like a victory in the moment. It felt like something cracking open. Not dramatically, not with noise, but the way old wood finally splits, after years of quiet pressure. I had carried the weight of being invisible in my own family for so long that I had stopped noticing it as weight. I called it normal. I called it just the way things are. What I didn't call it, for a very long time, was wrong. Here is what I've come to understand. The way people treat you is almost never about who you are. It is about the story they decided to tell about you, usually before you were old enough to write your own. My parents told a story where Daniel was the point and I was the context. They told it so consistently, for so many years, that I began to wonder if they were right. That wondering is the most dangerous thing. Not the cruelty itself, but the moment you start to agree with it. What saved me wasn't confrontation. It wasn't walking into a room and demanding to be seen. It was the quieter, harder choice to keep building anyway. To do the work because the work mattered, not because someone was watching. There is a particular kind of integrity that only develops in the absence of recognition. When you have to supply your own reasons for getting up in the morning. Your own measure of whether a day was worth something. I built that muscle over years, without knowing I was building it. And when Priya stood up at that reception and told a room full of people who I actually was, I didn't feel like I had finally been given something. I felt like something true had simply been said out loud. That distinction matters. The validation wasn't the point. The work was always the point. But I think there's a version of this story, the one I might have lived if I hadn't made the choices I made, where I spent my 30s still shrinking myself to fit inside my family's idea of me. Still driving 4 hours to sit at table 11. Still swallowing the sentence that ended with Daniel's sister and contained nothing else. What breaks that pattern isn't anger, though anger has its place. What breaks it is deciding, quietly and without announcement, that your definition of yourself is more reliable than anyone else's. That intelligence applied only to earning approval is intelligence wasted. That the most honest thing you can do with your life is build something real and let it speak when words feel useless. My parents are not villains. They are people who made choices they didn't examine, held biases they didn't question, and are now, slowly, imperfectly, being asked to look at what those choices cost. That reckoning belongs to them. My work is not to manage their reckoning. My work is to keep showing up with my back straight, to keep building things that matter, and to make sure that when someone finally asks who I am, the answer is already written somewhere they can find it. That is the only revenge worth having. Not the moment the room goes silent. The yes work that made the silence possible.